Hey, what's up? My name is John Bonjour. I'm a comic artist and film enthusiast. I have drawn some art and I would like to enthuse about some film. Today we are talking about Swamp Thing. The movie, not the show, or the other show. So Swamp Thing was directed by horror legend Wes Craven. It came out in 1982. And the context of it coming out in 1982 is really interesting. We'll get to that later. It follows scientist/plant-human hybrid Alec Holland as he becomes the Swamp Thing and tries to protect government agent Alice from a bunch of random bad guys. It's a rubber suit monster movie that's not a lot of plot. As I've been doing with these videos, I'm going to start with what doesn't work, then I'm going to go into what does, talk about a couple of pieces of trivia, don't have any wife quotes once again because my wife did not watch this movie, although if I was going to take a stab at what she might say, it would probably be something along the lines of, I'm glad you liked it. So starting with what doesn't work, as much as I do find it charming for my personal taste in film, the Swamp Thing look is extremely bad. This movie is a love letter to the rubber suit monsters, the Godzillas, and the creatures from the Black Lagoon, and just the practical, pretty cheaply made rubber suit monsters that you've seen in a lot of movies. But being a love letter to something doesn't inherently make it better or look good at all. And as much as I can enjoy the cheesy practical schlocky effects, I can't really defend them as being good or this movie as being particularly worth watching. This has been a really interesting one because I hadn't seen this either, and I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I didn't totally love it. There's a lot that I really do enjoy about this, but it is kind of boring. There's a lot of dialogue scenes, not that that can't be a good thing, it just, they're not delivered well or particularly interestingly written, in my opinion. I know Wes Craven was a part of writing that, so I feel gross even saying that. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't love the writing of this movie. I think it was pretty scattershot and bland for a lot of it. That said, anytime Adrienne Barbeau or the Swamp Thing costume or Alec Holland, anytime they're on screen, it's more interesting, more fun to watch. And then by the end of the movie, I'm not gonna lie, I was cheering, I was hooting and hollering. But yeah, by any standard, the costuming, not fantastic. I am worried about the ecological damage that we've done by the noxious gas created inside that costume. I know they shot this in a literal swamp, an actual swamp, so I can only imagine the hell that was. Just overall, the budget is extremely limited, and it shows. Not in ways that I think are particularly good. Where I just reviewed like Hellboy the Crooked Man, I thought that used its budget really well. The movie itself felt aware of what the budget was, where this feels like a movie, if given a bigger budget, a Wes Craven monster movie starring Adrienne Barbeau, this should be spectacular. This should be mind-blowingly fun to watch. And instead, it's entertaining and interesting, and I think a critical piece of understanding Wes Craven's filmography. But it's not really a necessary watch. I'm glad that I saw it, but in retrospect, this is the third weird call that I've made for this series. I think this is an example of a movie that overall, on the whole, doesn't necessarily work. That said, there are a lot of things in this movie that really do work for me. Again, for my personal taste, a lot of this really does fit. The costume is not great, although I will say close-ups on the face, it's beautiful. Farther shots away, again, beautiful. It's just when you get that middle range shot where you can see enough of the detail that you see where the pieces of the costume connect and fold in ways that they really shouldn't be, that's when it becomes a problem. But it is fun to have a practical costume. If you were gonna make a Swamp Thing movie today, you're not gonna do that. You might do it some, but it's not gonna be full practical. Just like the Man-Thing, they're not gonna do that full practical anymore. It's nice to see a version of a Swamp Thing movie that is 100% practical. It's also ridiculous and schlocky, and I think that works really well in its favor. In the first 20 minutes of the movie, a guy gets lit on fire, two people share a kiss who had just met maybe an hour ago. And my personal favorite, there's a Mission Impossible style mask reveal. Apropos of nothing, always love a good mask reveal, but especially one that's not set up, doesn't really mean a lot to us, and kind of doesn't affect the movie going forward. Speaking of cheesy things in this movie, it is unabashedly a rubber suit monster movie. I've said that a couple of times already, and it can't be more true. This is a movie that knows what it is, doesn't do it necessarily particularly well all the time, but there is something so charming to me about that really crunchy audio, practical, homemade feeling suits. There's something really enjoyable about just watching people make something that, yeah, maybe they don't have the budget or the means or the current ability to make, but boy, are they committed to making it either way. It doesn't necessarily have the same passion project feel that like a Dead Alive has. There is something really special about the energy of this movie, something that just feels like everybody was trying to sneak a joke into the movie the whole time, and it didn't quite pay off, but everybody really likes it. This is one of those movies that I watch and I think this is someone's very favorite movie of all time. Somebody has the poster for this flick on their bedroom wall and they love it. It is not necessarily me, but somebody really does, and that makes me happy. I like to see things that are different and weird and lovable, and I think that this is all three of those things. I will say this does lean into one of my favorite things about horror as a genre, just in general, is the most versatile genre of film I think we have. And I don't know, that might be kind of a hot take, but I think of things like romance or action. Those are pretty confined. They're constricted by rules and expectations of the audience. We know what we're getting into when we get into an action movie. Could it be full-blown, balls-to-the-wall, crazy action? Absolutely. It could also be pretty low-level, grounded, standard action, 100%. But that's kind of the breadth of where an action movie can go. Same with a romance movie. It's a healthy, cute romance or a super unhealthy romance. You're not going to get a ton of variation. Not that there's not some. There's room for creativity in all genres. But horror is one of those things where a movie like Swamp Thing and The Conjuring are in the same genre of film. You never know what you're getting into with a horror movie. And I think that's a beautiful thing, perfectly punctuated by this movie. Swamp Thing is a horror movie in the sense that it is a monster movie. It's not particularly scary, but neither are a lot of other horror movies. That's more of a matter of taste. But horror is not intended exclusively to scare you. It's supposed to be an examination of the shadows of our world, and that's something that leaves a lot of room for something like Swamp Thing. And I love that. I also, and this is a full-blown tangent, am very excited about whatever the next Swamp Thing is. I know James Gunn has announced that he's doing a Swamp Thing movie. I can't wait for that because I want to see a Swamp Thing movie. I love Swamp Thing. Alan Moore's run, especially Saga of the Swamp Thing, is some of the best comics writing I've ever read, and I just want to see that adapted into live action. I think that's going to be really sick. That's not really this movie, but it is an interesting thing. I'll say one of the strong suits of this movie, and I don't know if it was intentional, is it is absolutely hilarious. There is a cut in this movie that is the funniest thing I've ever seen.
Then we'll find the girl, the beast will follow. It doesn't exactly maintain a low profile.
It's just one of those things that I don't know if it was supposed to be funny. It sure plays like it was. Something also drives a speedboat into another speedboat, which is hilarious. Something about seeing that guy in a costume just piloting a speedboat. And there's another 30 or 40 examples of moments like that that I don't know if it was supposed to be funny, but if it was, they nailed it. And if it wasn't, what a treat. This is also a comic book adaptation, and for that, it's very fun. It's not adapting the Saga of the Swamp Thing run. Actually, one of my trivia points that I'm just gonna knock out right now, this was kind of the catalyst for Saga of the Swamp Thing, which is the comic story that completely reinvents the character and makes him relevant and interesting to read, I would say. So it's a shame that this movie isn't an adaptation of that, but more that that is an adaptation of this, but to be good. And it is a shame that these came out in that order because I think this could have been a very poignant, sweet, romantic, horror, drama, tragedy kind of thing. But instead it just ends up being this really schlocky movie. And what it is good, but I think it would have been really interesting to see an adaptation of that. But again, an adaptation of comics, and for that, it's really fun. It's very comic booky, there's a lot of weird monsters and strange things. The whole thing ends with a sword fight between a werewolf and Swamp Thing. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. Go watch it, it's an incredible sight to see. And with that, I have two more pieces of trivia. One, Wes Craven had not read the comics before he signed on to do this movie. He did read them before he made it, which I feel like is important. The reason that he hadn't read it is because comics weren't allowed in his church, and there's so much to unpack there that we really don't have time for. Other interesting piece of trivia I found for this movie is that Wes Craven showed his daughter, and she got upset by the number of times that Adrienne Barbeau tripped while being chased by a monster or a bad guy or whatever, and she said something along the lines of, "Dad, come on, girls don't just trip randomly," which ended up inspiring Craven to revamp the Final Girl idea and do something completely different, which turned into Nightmare on Elm Street. So I guess thank you, Swamp Thing, for Nightmare on Elm Street. Real quick, I do want to talk about just in Wes Craven's career. This is pretty early on. He had done a couple of other just straight horror movies and one porn, which is just, I just didn't know that. I was doing some research. Not that kind of research. Don't be like that. But I was doing research on when this came out and what the context was around it. He had done a series of other straight horror movies, most notably, I would say The Hills Have Eyes, which is great and wild if you haven't seen it. It is interesting to me that he chose to do Swamp Thing, because this is the 80s. This is, obviously Batman came out in like 89, the Superman movies were coming out. This is not a time where comic book movies are a huge property. Like, this is not a guaranteed hit. If you were to tell me 10 years ago Wes Craven made a Swamp Thing movie, I'd be like, okay, sure, I could kind of see where the thought process was there. But in the 80s, it was a weird time for him to do that, and I think he did want to kind of get out of doing just pure horror. And I think that's important because his filmography up to that point had been about pushing boundaries. Swamp Thing is not a movie that pushes a lot of boundaries. In fact, there's a topless scene that was only shown to the European audiences because they felt like that was the market that would want that. And he didn't really want to do it, which I think is really interesting because his whole filmography up to that point was cannibal hillbillies and possessions in churches and all these things that would make people really, really uncomfortable. And then all of a sudden he comes in and does this funny, cute, semi-romantic, mostly cheesy monster movie. And I think that really refined what he was looking to do in his career. If I'm taking guesses, this was the movie that kind of created that balance in tone that he was able to bring in A Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't think we can guarantee that Freddy Krueger would have been as charismatic and funny as he was if we hadn't have gotten Swamp Thing. Obviously, I can't say any of that for sure, but this does feel like a testing ground for tone for Craven. So that is my final thought on this movie. I really enjoyed it. It's very interesting in context of Wes Craven's other films. It's an interesting adaptation of The Swamp Thing, although not particularly riveting from a story perspective. But as a comic book movie, it definitely is an outlier in what you expect from a comic book movie, and I like that about it. I like the schockiness, I enjoy the cheesiness, the horrible dialogue and bad audio is fun and charming to me. I don't think that this is a great movie. This isn't one that I'm telling everybody, oh, you have to see the Swamp Thing movie. But if you're a huge comic book movie nerd, if you're big on Wes Craven, or if you just really like Swamp Thing and weird swamp creatures, I don't think it's a bad way to go. Like, I think it's a very entertaining, interesting movie that has some pretty serious flaws. Up next week, I feel like we've lost the plot just a tiny little bit on this being a horror series for Halloween. We will be watching slasher classic The Burning. You're not gonna believe this shit. Logos told me it's on this website. That is the theme for this year, I guess. So, you're welcome. I do want to know what you thought of Swamp Thing. Did you enjoy it? How is your Halloween going? What other movies should I consider for this Halloween series? Let me know in the comments below, and happy Halloween. Thank you so much for watching this video and checking out my channel. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on movies, comics, TV shows, movies based on comics, comics based on TV shows based on movies based on comics, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and comment down below what you'd like me to review next, or do none of that because I am not your dad.